Episode 8, Alasdair MacIntyre After Virtue. How to Rebuild Morality in a Fragmented Age. Part 1. The World After the Collapse. Let me take you into a scene. A man named Julian sits alone in a tiny apartment 8 stories above a city humming with neon, traffic, and fractal human motion. It's late, the kind of late where the streets are thin with silence, but the digital world is still roaring. His phone glows in his hand. He scrolls. A political firestorm, a celebrity scandal, a pylon, an algorithmic outrage cycle bursting like fireworks. Thousands of moral claims blitzing across his screen. Do better. Educate yourself. This is unacceptable. Here's the truth. No, here's the actual truth. You're evil if you disagree. You're weak if you stay silent. You're complicit if you don't repost. Julian feels pulled in 1,000 moral directions at once. He watches people scream about justice, but each means something different. He sees people invoke rights, but each insists on a contradictory set. He sees one group call something virtuous, while another calls the exact same thing immoral. It hits him. Everyone is speaking the language of morality, but no one is speaking the same moral language. Julian, into the quiet of his empty room. How do any of us know what's right anymore? And with that question, raw, honest, modern, we enter the world Alasdair MacIntyre diagnosed so powerfully in After Virtue. A world where the pieces of a moral system still float around us. Words like justice, courage, freedom, virtue. But the structure holding them together has collapsed. A world where we argue endlessly about morality without any shared foundation for what morality is. A world where feelings have replaced reasoning, where performance has replaced character, and where outrage has replaced wisdom. A world where we are living, MacIntyre says, after the death of a shared ethical universe. Tonight, we're going to walk through the ruins and learn how to rebuild something better. This is Philosophy for Better Humans, and I'm Charles Sebastian Whitby. Part 2. Introduction. Meeting Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre might be the most influential moral philosopher you've never heard of. A Scotsman with a fierce intellect, a love of Aristotle, a suspicion of modern individualism, and the courage to say something unfashionable. The modern world is morally broken because it has forgotten what morality is for. When After Virtue was published in 1981, it was like a philosophical earthquake. Its thesis was bold, devastating, and unignorable. We live among the fragments of an older moral order without realizing the structure has collapsed. We still use the words justice, virtue, responsibility, rights, integrity, but their meanings have been hollowed out, like ancient coins whose faces have worn smooth. MacIntyre compared us to survivors of a great moral catastrophe who have kept the vocabulary but lost the grammar. We're like people who inherited a toolbox but forgot what the tools are for. The result? A society where moral arguments never resolve. People talk past each other. Feelings replace reasoning. Identity replaces ethics. Politics becomes tribal warfare. Institutions manage outcomes instead of cultivating virtue. Individuals have no shared vision of a good life. Outrage becomes a currency, and being good becomes an empty performance. Sound familiar? MacIntyre believed our age resembles the late Roman Empire, a civilization wobbling under the weight of its own fragmentation. But he wasn't despairing. He believed virtue could be rebuilt, not through ideology, not through technology, not through politics, but through the revival of practices, communities, and shared stories that teach human beings how to live well. Tonight, we're going to walk through his diagnosis, his philosophy, and his blueprint for rebuilding meaning in an era that has lost its moral compass. Part 3. The Moral Ruins of Modernity. MacIntyre's Diagnosis. Let's paint the picture the way MacIntyre does. Imagine a world where every scientific institution collapses, labs destroyed, universities burned, textbooks lost. Generations later, people recover bits and pieces. A page about atoms, a lab coat, some chemical symbols scribbled on a scrap, a broken microscope. With no understanding of the scientific worldview, people begin using these pieces in contradictory ways, arguing fiercely about their meanings. This, MacIntyre says, is what happened to morality. We inherited fragments from Aristotle, Christianity, Stoicism, Enlightenment, rationalism, romantic individualism, democratic values, human rights traditions, but we lost the coherent moral framework that made them make sense. We still say things like justice, fairness, virtue, rights, responsibility, freedom. But we no longer agree on what humans are for or what the good life looks like. So we argue endlessly, morally, intensely, emotionally. But without shared foundations, our moral arguments become performances, power plays, expressions of emotion, tribal affirmations, identity statements. This brings us to one of MacIntyre's most powerful ideas, emotivism. The idea that modern moral claims are not really reasoning, but expressions of personal feeling. Let's go deeper. Part 4. Emotivism. When morality becomes just opinion. Picture a modern argument. Person A: that's unjust. Person B: no, that's justice. Person C: you're all wrong. Person D: you're all immoral. MacIntyre says, none of these people are speaking the same moral language. They're expressing attitudes, not referring to shared moral facts. This is emotivism, the belief that moral statements are just expressions of personal preference or emotion. Murder is wrong becomes, I really dislike murder. Justice becomes, the thing my tribe supports. Freedom becomes, whatever benefits my identity. Rights become, the things I want society to give me. Let me give you a modern illustration. Scroll through social media. What do you see? Performative activism, outrage badges, virtue signaling, identity battles, emotional declarations. No shared definitions, no shared moral reasoning. Everyone is moral in a way that has become untethered from any common moral universe. MacIntyre argues that this moral fragmentation creates a society that feels confused, anxious, distrustful, polarized, chaotic, morally exhausted. Sound familiar? He says modern moral debates feel never-ending because they cannot be resolved. Why? Because each person is arguing from a completely different sense of what morality even is. This is the world Julian, from our opening, was living in. This is the world we live in today. But MacIntyre doesn't stop at diagnosis. He offers a path forward. And it begins with an ancient idea modern people desperately need to rediscover. Telos, purpose. Part 5. The Loss of Telos. Why modern morality cannot be whole. Aristotle believed a simple, powerful truth. You cannot define good without knowing what something is for. A good farmer grows healthy crops. A good knife cuts well. A good teacher cultivates flourishing in students. But what is a good human being? Aristotle had an answer. A human is good when they cultivate virtue and live toward their highest potential, their telos, their purpose, their flourishing. Modernity rejected all of that. Today we say, everyone defines their own purpose. Everyone chooses their own meaning. Do what you want. Follow your truth. Create yourself. It sounds empowering. MacIntyre says it's catastrophic. Because if humans have no shared purpose, we have no shared concept of goodness. And if we have no shared concept of goodness, we have no basis for shared morality. Which leaves us with preference, emotion, identity, power, tribalism, outrage, feelings, instead of virtue. MacIntyre believes the death of a shared telos is the root of our moral crisis. We cannot agree because we have no common end, no shared why. But here is the beauty of MacIntyre's philosophy. He doesn't say we need to invent a new telos. He says we need to rebuild it from the practices and traditions that have always formed human flourishing. This brings us to one of his greatest contributions: practices, virtues, and the internal goods that shape the soul. And Joey, this next part is powerful. Part 6. Practices, virtues, and the good life. MacIntyre's core idea. Let me tell you a story MacIntyre loved to use. Not verbatim, but in spirit. Imagine a young boy named Thomas. Thomas wants to play chess with his father, but he doesn't understand the game yet. The father offers an incentive. Thomas, if you play one full game with me, no quitting, I'll give you a candy bar afterward. Thomas lights up. He sits down. He focuses. He moves the pieces without whining. He pays attention like never before. Why? Because he wants the candy bar. MacIntyre calls this an external good, a reward that has nothing to do with the activity itself. But something interesting happens over time. Thomas begins to enjoy the game. He becomes fascinated with strategy. He admires good moves. He becomes frustrated with sloppy ones. He takes pride in improving. He starts reading about openings. He watches videos of grandmasters. At some point, Thomas no longer cares about candy bars. He wants to be good at chess. This is what MacIntyre calls internal goods. These are the deep, intrinsic rewards that only come from participating in a practice with dedication, humility, and courage. In this simple story lies one of the most important ideas in After Virtue. Virtues are formed by participating in practices that cultivate excellence. Let's slow down and make this vivid. Part 7. What is a practice? The engine of virtue. MacIntyre defines a practice as a coherent, complex, socially established activity through which goods internal to that activity are realized by the pursuit of excellence. Let me make that conversational. A practice is any activity that has standards of excellence, requires learning and discipline, shapes character, produces internal goods, is passed down through community, demands virtue for mastery. Examples include medicine, carpentry, martial arts, teaching, architecture, nursing, engineering, music, cooking, scientific research, parenting, political deliberation, writing, craftsmanship, farming, even philosophical inquiry itself. A practice is not a hobby. A hobby is, I do this because it's fun. A practice is, I submit myself to a discipline because it makes me better. Practices require patience, honesty, courage, perseverance, humility, attention, justice. A person cannot excel in a practice while being vicious. This is why practices form character. They shape who we become. But modern society has a problem. We no longer organize life around practices. We organize it around external goods, money, fame, power, attention, metrics. These external goods corrupt practices. Let's go deeper. Part 8. Internal goods versus external goods. Let's return to our chess player Thomas. External goods are candy, praise, trophies, money, social approval, status. Internal goods are insight, mastery, fairness, courage under pressure, patience, respect for skill, commitment to excellence, joy in collaborative competition. MacIntyre says internal goods are what make a practice meaningful. And here's the revolutionary part. Virtue is the quality that allows you to pursue internal goods even when external goods tempt you away. For example, a doctor who values healing more than billing. A lawyer who values justice more than winning. A teacher who values learning more than test scores. A carpenter who values craftsmanship more than speed. A politician who values truth more than applause. A scientist who values discovery more than prestige. These people have virtue. Virtue is integrity under pressure. But here's the tragic part. Modern institutions reward external goods, not internal excellence. And when external goods dominate, practices begin to die. This insight hits hard when applied to real life. Let's explore three areas where MacIntyre believes the modern world is failing. Part 9. How modernity destroys practices. 1. Corporations reward metrics, not excellence. A nurse is judged not by compassion or skill, but by efficiency ratios, chart completion, patient throughput, billing codes, satisfaction scores. A teacher is judged not by how they transform students, but by standardized tests, compliance, performance metrics, administrative reports. MacIntyre says, when external goods dominate, practices decay into institutions. Institutions are necessary. They house and protect practices. But institutions always drift toward external goods. We see this drift everywhere, and it creates moral injury. Let's keep going. 2. Influencer culture rewards attention, not virtue. Internal goods of a practice, like journalism, include truthfulness, accuracy, courage, fairness, public service. But modern media rewards virality, outrage, sensationalism, tribal loyalty, click-through rate, engagement. MacIntyre would say, we replace journalists with content creators and internal goods with external goods. Now we have noise, not wisdom. 3. Tech and algorithmic systems reward optimization, not excellence. Algorithms reward speed, scale, addiction, disruption, novelty, engagement, emotional reaction. But they have no concept of virtue, telos, narrative, human flourishing, community, tradition. For MacIntyre, this is catastrophic. We have built a society optimized for efficiency and stripped of its moral grammar. Which brings us to three archetypes MacIntyre calls the rulers of modernity: the manager, the therapist, the bureaucrat, and Joey. This section is incredible. Part 10. The manager, the therapist, and the bureaucrat. MacIntyre argues that these three roles dominate the modern moral landscape. Let's walk through them in story form. 1. The manager, technician without telos. The manager believes all problems can be solved through technique, efficiency, optimization, metrics, process, procedure. He doesn't ask, what is the good life? What does flourishing look like? What virtues does this community need? He asks, how can I increase output? How can I improve performance? How do we optimize? MacIntyre's critique: the manager assumes value neutrality. He treats moral questions as technical ones. This leads to soulless workplaces, burnout, moral injury, optimization without purpose, efficiency without meaning. The manager may be competent, but he cannot cultivate virtue. 2. The therapist, adaptation without purpose. The therapist tells individuals, let me help you adjust to society. Instead of asking whether the society is healthy, he treats anxiety, alienation, disconnection, emptiness, meaninglessness as personal issues, not social or moral ones. MacIntyre would say, modern therapy often helps people adapt to morally broken systems. This is not an attack on therapy. It is an attack on therapeutic culture. A culture that treats meaning crises as chemical imbalances rather than philosophical voids. 3. The bureaucrat. Rules without wisdom. The bureaucrat enforces policies, regulations, protocols, checklists, frameworks, without context, without character, without judgment. MacIntyre says, bureaucracy pretends that rules can replace virtue. They cannot. A virtuous nurse does the right thing not because of protocol, but because of compassion. A virtuous leader does the right thing not because of a manual, but because of wisdom. Bureaucracy eliminates judgment, and judgment is the source of practical wisdom, phronesis, the heart of Aristotelian virtue. These three archetypes rule our world. They shape institutions, they shape politics, they shape corporations, they shape culture, and they have no language for virtue. This is why our world feels hollow, performative, chaotic, anxious, distrustful, fragmented. MacIntyre says, we no longer live in a moral community. We live in a society of managers and consumers. But he doesn't end in despair. He believes the solution is ancient and urgently modern. It begins with the rediscovery of narrative. Part 11. Narrative. Why we need stories to become human. Let me ask you something. How do you know who you are? Not your name, not your job, not your personality traits, but your identity as a moral being, a character in a story. MacIntyre believed humans are narrative creatures. We can only understand ourselves inside a story. Tell a few emotional examples. A soldier returning home who understands his life only through his unit's story. A mother raising children whose days make sense in the arc of family history. A young person seeking purpose who joins a tradition, a craft, or a practice to locate themselves in something larger. Without shared narratives, we can't answer the key questions. Who am I? What am I doing? What kind of person should I become? What story am I part of? Modern life tears narrative apart. Hypermobility, individualism, consumerism, algorithmic personalization, identity fragmentation, rootlessness, loss of communal rituals. Result? A person who doesn't know their story doesn't know their virtues. And a society without a shared story cannot reason morally. This is MacIntyre's great warning. We are living in a world after the collapse of the moral narrative that once held us together. But MacIntyre ends with hope, a vision of how to rebuild virtue in a disordered world. That's where we're headed next. Part 12. How, after virtue, explains the modern world. Shocking accuracy. Let's return to Julian, the man sitting alone, scrolling through moral chaos in the opening scene. He's overwhelmed by contradictions, confused by moral jargon, frustrated by endless political shouting, and anxious that nothing seems to make sense. Here's what MacIntyre would say. Of course he feels this way. It is exactly what happens when a society loses its shared moral narrative. Let's walk through the crises MacIntyre predicted and how they manifest in our world with astonishing clarity. 1. Polarization, when emotivism replaces shared reason. We often talk about polarization as if it's new. MacIntyre says polarization is the natural consequence of moral fragmentation. When people have no shared telos, no shared moral foundation, no shared virtue vocabulary, they cannot reason with each other. So instead they shout, shame, signal retreat into tribes, assume the worst view, disagreement as threat, weaponize morality. What we call polarization, MacIntyre calls emotivism in political form. It's not disagreement that breaks us, it's the lack of shared moral grammar to resolve disagreement. Without shared first principles, arguments don't end, they escalate. You see this everywhere. If you disagree with me, you're evil. If you don't support my cause, you're complicit. If you're with them, you're against us. If you don't repost this, you're the problem. MacIntyre predicted this cultural drift 4 decades ago. 2. Identity politics. Without shared stories, people retreat into tribes. When the overarching narrative collapses, nation, tradition, virtue, common purpose, humans still need identity. So they form micro-identities, political tribes, digital tribes, ideological subcultures, online communities, hashtag movements. Identity becomes the new sacred. But identity without narrative is brittle, so people cling harder, defend more aggressively, interpret disagreement as annihilation. MacIntyre believed that identity politics, left and right, is what happens when virtue traditions collapse and moral language becomes weaponized. He would say, people are not evil. They are morally homeless. 3. The culture of outrage, performing morality without virtue. MacIntyre believed that societies without practices lean toward performative morality, not real virtue, performed virtue. He called this expressionist morality, morality as a public performance of feelings. Today we call it virtue signaling, call-out culture, clout chasing, outrage cycles, moral grandstanding. We see people posting moral declarations not because they live virtuously, but because expressing emotion online signals tribal membership. MacIntyre predicted this perfectly. Morality becomes drama when virtue has no shared meaning. 4. Loneliness and the meaning crisis, when community disintegrates. Without communities of practice, people lose mentors, role models, moral guidance, shared rituals, stable identity, intergenerational wisdom, accountability, belonging. Loneliness skyrockets. Depression rises. People feel adrift. MacIntyre says, "You cannot form a good character alone. Virtue requires community. Without communities that teach virtue, modern people feel spiritually malnourished." 5. Politics without virtue. The manager, the therapist, and the bureaucrat run the world. MacIntyre believed that modern societies replace moral reasoning with technique. Instead of wisdom, we get policy experts, consultants, branding specialists, optimization engineers, PR strategists, managers, bureaucrats, therapists who help individuals adapt to systems that lack moral integrity. This is why modern institutions feel soulless, opaque, inauthentic, procedural, technocratic, alienating. The moral dimension is missing. MacIntyre insists institutions cannot replace character. Policies cannot replace virtue. Efficiency cannot replace meaning. 6. The loss of narrative. Humans still act in stories, but no longer share one. This is perhaps the most poetic part of MacIntyre's thought. I can only answer the question, "What am I to do?" if I can answer the prior question, "Of what story do I find myself a part?" But modern society privatizes meaning, fractures identity, disintegrates community, undermines tradition, rejects shared purposes, replaces deep narratives with consumerism. Result? People act like characters without a script. Lives lack coherence. Purpose dissolves. Identity becomes a performance. This is the root of the meaning crisis. 7. Why the modern world feels exhausting. Let's pull all of this together. MacIntyre believes our world feels exhausting because we have moral language without moral meaning. We have identity without community. We have emotions without shared reasoning. We have institutions without virtue. We have freedom without telos. We have narratives without coherence. We have practices without excellence. We have choices without guidance. We have outrage without wisdom. We have individuality without belonging. We have performance without substance. And MacIntyre's conclusion is devastating and beautiful. Modern society is not destroyed. It is disoriented. We aren't evil. We are morally unrooted. We aren't depraved. We are dislocated. MacIntyre does not condemn us. He diagnoses us with empathy and clarity. And then he offers a path forward. One of the most powerful, hopeful human paths in modern philosophy. It begins with three things: practices, narrative, community. And it ends with a call to rediscover the heart of moral life. Let's enter that part now. Part 13. Rebuilding Virtue, the MacIntyre Blueprint. Let's shift now from diagnosis to reconstruction, from the ruins to the blueprint. MacIntyre is not telling us to go back in time. He is telling us to rebuild the conditions that make virtue possible. And he offers 3 pillars. 1. Join a practice. Root yourself in a community. Live inside a narrative with purpose. Let's explore each with emotional, modern, cinematic clarity. 1. Join a practice, not a hobby, not a job, a practice. A practice shapes you, calls you higher, breaks your ego, demands excellence, forms virtue. Imagine a woodworking apprenticeship, a martial arts dojo, a nursing team with deep mentorship, a medical residency, a classical music conservatory, a community garden, a monastery, a journalistic tradition, a philosophical circle, a craft guild, a neighborhood kitchen, a civic volunteer group. These places teach patience, humility, courage, fairness, responsibility, self-mastery. Practices form character because they demand virtue. MacIntyre would tell you, find something difficult and good, and give yourself to it. 2. Root yourself in a community of character. Virtue requires example, imitation, correction, context, relationship, accountability, continuity. You cannot become courageous alone. You cannot become just alone. You cannot become wise alone. We need mentors, elders, peers, apprentices, traditions, rituals, shared commitments. MacIntyre says you become someone through the communities you inhabit. Choose communities that cultivate character, not just consumption, distraction, or identity. 3. Live inside a narrative with purpose. The question, "Who am I?" can only be answered inside a story. MacIntyre invites you to ask, what story am I living? What story do I belong to? What story teaches me how to act? What story gives meaning to my struggles? What story tells me what kind of person to become? This could be a religious tradition, a philosophical tradition, a community tradition, a family narrative, a vocation, a craft, a social mission. But it must be something that transcends your individual whims, something that gives structure to the arc of your life, something that tells you this is what a good person looks like. Without that, you're a character without a script, lost, drifting, improvising badly. MacIntyre believes to rebuild virtue, we must rebuild the narrative environment in which virtue grows. Part 14. The St. Benedict Solution. The ending heard around the world. Toward the end of After Virtue, MacIntyre delivers one of the most famous, haunting lines in all of modern philosophy. We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, St. Benedict. Let me explain this with storytelling power. In the 5th century, as the Roman Empire collapsed, civilization was unraveling. Political chaos, social fragmentation, moral decay, institutional failure. Everything that had structured the moral world was crumbling. A young man named Benedict left the corruption of Rome and began building small communities committed to virtue, prayer, labor, hospitality, literacy, excellence, stability, tradition. These Benedictine communities preserved moral knowledge, educational practices, and social stability for centuries. They kept the embers of civilization glowing through Europe's darkest hours. MacIntyre's point is not religious, it's structural. He believes we need something similar today. Communities grounded in virtue that preserve practices, narratives, and character through the chaos of modernity. Not political messiahs, not ideological saviors, not billionaires, not technocrats. Communities, practices, people of character. The new St. Benedict is a teacher forming students, a nurse mentoring younger nurses, a coach shaping discipline, a craftsperson preserving tradition, a parent embodying virtue, a local community practicing justice, a philosopher teaching clear reasoning, a neighbor embodying compassion, a small group committed to truth, a mentor guiding apprentices, a community choosing excellence over convenience. MacIntyre's vision is not grand. It is humble, local, human, embodied, practical, beautiful. He is saying civilization is rebuilt from the ground up in the small places where virtue is practiced. And this is the hope at the heart of After Virtue. Part 15. Reflective Summary. Gathering the Moral Threads. Let's slow down for a moment and gather the threads of the journey we've walked together. Sometimes philosophy gives us answers, but sometimes, like tonight, it gives us clarity, a clear map, a recognizable landscape, a sense of where we are and where we might be going. This is one of those nights. Let's take a reflective walk through the core insights of After Virtue, not as bullet points, but as a woven understanding of our moral world. 1. Modern society inherited moral words, but lost the moral grammar. We kept justice, virtue, rights, freedom, obligation, but they float unanchored. We use the language of morality with none of the shared structure that once gave those words meaning. This is why our moral debates feel endless and unsatisfying. We're not morally confused, we're morally dislocated. 2. Emotivism rules the age. When a society loses shared moral foundations, moral disagreements become emotional battles. Not reason versus reason, not principle versus principle, but emotion versus emotion, identity versus identity, tribe versus tribe. That's why modern politics feels like theatre, why online debates feel like chaos, why outrage feels endless. We aren't debating morality, we're performing it. 3. Without telos, virtue cannot survive. You cannot know what good means unless you know what something is for. Aristotle knew this. MacIntyre revives it. Humans need a shared vision of flourishing, a purpose, a telos to make sense of. Responsibility, excellence, courage, justice, compassion, integrity. Modern culture tells us, create your own purpose. It sounds empowering, but taken to an extreme, it leaves people unmoored, unsure, adrift. Virtue becomes subjective. Goodness becomes arbitrary. MacIntyre calls us back to shared purposes, to communal understandings of what it means to become good. 4. Practices form character, and institutions corrupt practices. This is one of MacIntyre's most profound insights. A practice is hard, humbling, demanding, beautiful, ancient, noble. A practice asks you to get better at something that matters, to pursue internal goods like excellence, fairness, courage, not external goods like money, fame, or status. Practices make humans whole. But institutions, focused on metrics, efficiency, power, tend to corrupt practices. This is why modern life feels hollow. We've built institutions, but lost practices. We've optimized efficiency and neglected virtue. We've measured everything and understood nothing. 5. Community, narrative, and tradition are the foundations of moral life. You cannot form character alone. You cannot learn virtue alone. You cannot pursue excellence alone. Humans need mentors, apprentices, peers, elders, traditions, shared stories, communal rituals. MacIntyre tells us, a good life is a narrative life, one lived inside a community with a story larger than yourself. This is not limiting, it's liberating. It gives coherence to the arc of who we are becoming. 6. The modern world is not evil, it is morally rootless. We are not living in a moral desert. We are living among moral fragments, buried artifacts, broken tools, half-remembered stories, abandoned rituals. MacIntyre offers us clarity without condemnation, critique without despair. He invites us to rebuild the moral life from the inside out. 7. The new St. Benedict is us, ordinary people choosing virtue in ordinary places. MacIntyre believes civilization will be renewed not by breakthroughs, but by character, not by ideological revolutions, but by communities of practice, not by systems, but by people. People who form apprentices, preserve excellence, pass on traditions, cultivate honesty, resist corruption, live with purpose, act with courage, serve others, anchor their lives in a narrative of the good. This is the quiet revolution MacIntyre leaves us with, a revolution of character, of craft, of virtue. The slow rebuilding of moral life from the ground up, family by family, community by community, practice by practice, person by person. And now, let's bring it home. Thank you for walking with me tonight through the ruins and the hope of Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. If you felt something settle inside you, a recognition, a clarity, maybe even a quiet resolve, you're not alone. MacIntyre's work has that effect on anyone who genuinely listens. It doesn't offer easy answers. It offers a way of seeing, a way of understanding why we feel morally overwhelmed, why our culture seems adrift, why our debates go nowhere, why so many feel unmoored, why modern life feels shallow, why character seems rare, and why community matters more than we ever realized. But it also offers us a way forward, a way to rebuild ourselves and the world around us. Start with a practice. Join a community. Live inside a story that calls you to excellence. Reclaim the virtues that make us fully human. If tonight gave you insight, meaning, or even a moment of connection, I invite you to subscribe and continue this journey with us. This is Philosophy for Better Humans, and I'm Charles Sebastian Whitby. Until next time, may you find a good practice, a good community, and a good story to live inside. And may you cultivate the virtues that help the world remember how to be whole again. Good night.